Hello, I'm Laura McInerney, co-founder of Teacher Tapp, the app that asks thousands of teachers 3 daily questions so you can find out what's really going on the ground in schools. We've teamed up with the guys from InnerDrive to bring you InnerTapp, where we look at what teachers are thinking and what the research is saying about key topics in education. Today, we're bringing you the facts about mobile phone use in schools. How often are they being used? Is the problem as bad as people think? And do tougher rules actually work? Let's start with the facts. In secondary schools, 1 in 10 lessons, 10%, are disrupted by a pupil using a mobile phone. And that number hasn't budged for over a year. And it's not individual, potentially inexperienced teachers dealing with this problem. In a single week, 60% of secondary teachers saw a phone being used when it shouldn't be. So despite policies getting stricter, phones are still sneaking in. Meanwhile, primary schools are a different universe. 78% of primary schools collect phones at the start of the day, 13% ban them entirely, and the result? Near zero disruption in lessons. In secondary, 11% are collecting phones each morning, and only 5% ban them from sight altogether, which means 84% of secondary schools are relying on rules along the lines of keep it in your bag. And unsurprisingly, this means teachers are playing constant whack-a-mole. We looked at whether stricter policies make a difference, and here's what we found. In schools where phones are allowed at break and lunch but are banned in lessons, phones disrupt a quarter of lessons, 25%. But in schools that collect phones at the start of the day, disruptions drop to just 1%. That's a massive difference, and it does suggest that if you want to reduce lesson interruptions, the best policy is no phones. Interestingly, more schools are moving towards tighter policies, but not all the way. The number of secondary schools where phones are allowed in bags or jackets, but they must stay out of sight, has grown from 48% last year to 58% now. Among teachers working in schools where phones are allowed at lunch and break times, 76%, the vast majority, wish their school would just ban them altogether, and nearly half strongly feel that. Of course, phones aren't just a disruption. There is a debate about whether they can be useful. In past surveys, teachers have said that students use phones for taking photos of notes or accessing school apps. In fact, 20% of secondary schools have one-to-one devices where every student has a laptop or a tablet anyway. So there is an argument we're already losing an attention battle to computers. But in most cases, those devices are more locked down with controls on the apps. And ultimately, the data on mobile phones is clear that when they are allowed at break and lunchtime, they do more often creep into lessons. So what does the research literature say about this issue? Here's InnerDrive's Bradley Bush to give you the lowdown on what we currently know.
There has been a huge range of research from all over the world on the effect that mobile phones have on students. Excessive phone use has been associated with lower grades, reduced well-being, worse sleep, and bullying. So let's jump right in and look at some of these studies. This is a study from England that explored what happens when schools ban mobile phones. Researchers looked at 91 schools across a range of cities. They found that after schools introduced a phone ban, student test scores tended to go up. But here's the interesting part, the biggest improvements were seen in students who are already struggling. This chimes with a study in America. Researchers asked students to record how often they use their phones during class for things like texting, checking social media, browsing the internet, or even playing games. They then compared student test scores versus this. They found that students who used their phones less during class tended to get higher test scores. Staying in America, another study found that being on your phone for 4 hours a day was associated with lower psychological well-being. For those who use it over 7 hours per day, they were more than twice as likely to have been diagnosed with depression or anxiety. In Brazil, researchers tested the relationship between smartphone use and academic performance. Results suggest there's a significant relationship between a greater total time spent using smartphones and lower academic performance. They found for every 100 minutes spent using a smartphone, students' ranking at their school fell by 6.3 points. Similar results to this were also found in studies in Nigeria, Malaysia, and in Australia, which showed a negative correlation between time spent on phones and academic achievement. In China, researchers did a large study where they surveyed over 12,000 students. They also found that students who use their phone a lot were more likely to struggle in school. For example, students who spent more than 5 hours a day on their phone during the weekend were about 1.6 times more likely to report poor grades compared to those who used their phone for less than 2 hours. On school days, this difference was even bigger. A really interesting study in Spain detailed what happens when 2 regions of the country banned phones in schools. They found that bullying rates dropped significantly. The researchers suggested that without phones, it became harder for students to send hurtful messages, spread rumours, or exclude others online during school hours. This echoes the finding from a study in South Africa, which found over half the students reported unwanted or unpleasant calls or texts. A study in Norway also found that schools who supported banning mobile phones reported significantly less incidents of bullying among their students. And finally, a study on university students in India found a significant correlation between high mobile phone dependence and lower quality of sleep. The combination of these different types of studies from different countries strongly points towards the negative impact mobile phones can have on students, be it distractions in class, dips in well-being, or bullying. As well as considering bans, many schools that we at InnerDrive have worked with have started teaching students how to use their phone better when at home. This includes putting them away during homework and study sessions, as well as toning down the backlight in the evening to help improve sleep habits. One of our favourite tips comes from a fascinating research paper. They found that turning your phone onto the setting of grayscale, which looks like this, reduced mobile phone screen time by 38 minutes each day. By making the phone less visually appealing, it led to students using it less. Mobile phones have changed how students live their lives, and the associated consequences need to be carefully navigated. And that's why we think it's something that all educators need to be aware of.
So where does all that leave us? Phones are still a problem. Tighter rules help, but only if they're practical to enforce. Total bans in secondary schools are rare, but where they exist, they work. And yet, schools are cautious. Bans can be unpopular with parents, hard to manage at scale, and tech, let's face it, still has its uses. But here's the thing. As long as phones are on the pupils, in the school, they'll creep into the classrooms, inevitably. The data's clear. The question is whether schools and the government are ready to act on that fact.